All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. So today we are finally going to be talking about the Helminth and how to best utilize it so that you don't bankrupt yourself. But first, for that, what is the Helminth system? Where do you get it? And what is it for? Basically, you're going to go to the Heart of Deimos. You're going to level the main syndicate up to level 3. You're going to buy the segment from Brother, build it, and then install it in your ship in the infested room. Once you have done that, you will have full access to the Helminth system, and you'll be able to use the Helminth system to replace powers on any given Warframe. Any Warframe can have its powers replaced, and each Warframe in the game can donate one of its 4 powers to the Helminth. So, basically, you feed the Helminth, and it gives you a large amount of customization for any given Warframe. For that, you will have to subsume Warframes, which will cost you resources unique to the Helminth. Thankfully, the way you get these resources is by giving the Helminth very common resources, which is going to work out great. But whenever you infuse things, you are also going to need further resources. So this is a very resource-intensive system in general. For the sake of showing it off, we are going to take this Grendel and infuse an ability on it, in this case Smite, and show how it works. So, infusing a Smite, we get to choose where it goes. Even though Smite is a first ability, it does not have to go in the first slot. It can go anywhere we'd like. So in this case, let's say we're going to replace Pulverize, confirm that, and then we get the option on which configurations to put it on. You can put it on A and C, all of them, just on one, whatever you'd like, and this gives you the option to try things out on just one configuration or have multiple builds across one single Warframe, and it's very, very nice. With this, there is also the note that you can infuse multiple things onto different configurations. You can only put one ability replacement on any given Warframe at a time, but for example, I can have Smite on configuration A and Shuriken on configuration B and another third power on configuration C, and this expands as you buy more configuration slots for any given Warframe to give you lots and lots of options. This stuff is all great. Let's throw Smite onto this Grendel, even though I'm going to end up feeding him later. Infusing will give you experience, as you saw on the top left, to try and progress you through the levels. And at any time, you can also remove the infusion from a Warframe very, very easily. Click of a button. Super simple stuff. It's on and it's gone. Doesn't cost you anything to remove it, so if you put something on that you don't like, or you replace the wrong ability, or some other mishap happens, it'll be very, very easy to get back to the vanilla version of your given Warframe. With that, the complicated part of this system comes in whenever we need to feed the Helminth. Now this is where it looks simple and it looks easy at first, but this part of the system is absolutely deceptive in how resource intensive it is. Because you could look at these and you could be like, oh, alloy plate, 15,000 alloy plate, that doesn't cost me nothing, and then just immediately just click through and get 30% on our Calx, or on our oxides rather, in the top right there, and not think about it, and maybe just keep clicking and just dump all these resources down a drain. But there is a really important thing to note with this system, and that is a general rule that I have applied to the Helminth and has really increased my enjoyment of the system a lot. And that is to never, under any circumstances, click a resource unless I see this full green arrow and get my full 30% in the top right. Because just for the sake of example, if I click ferrite and I put 20,000 ferrite into this, Helminth will eat it up and I'll get 30%. But when that green arrow goes away, I'm going to spend the exact same amount of resources and get 15%. And if I get this red arrow, I'm going to spend the exact same amount of resources and I'm going to get 3%. Now, from 3%, it's not going to go lower than that. But I'm going to tell you right now, 3% of any given resource here is absolutely, under no circumstances, worth it. You never want to see a red arrow. And because you never want to see a red arrow, that means you can't click anything unless it's green. With that, there is a really important note as to why this is, and that is because the Helminth will gradually get hungrier over time for things that it has not had. So if I have this red arrow here, that means that in 24 hours or so, it's going to become neutral. And then 24 or so hours after that, it's going to become a green arrow. But if you just never see the red arrow, that will save you 24 hours towards that resource being the most effective it can be, which is where you want them to be at all times. So, really, just wager this out. Just wait it out, and don't overspend resources on this, with one major exception we're going to go over near the end. This is not worth just dumping all 2 million of the ferrite that you have built up over time into, when you could dump in like 400,000 and have finished the entirety of the system instead. Going the cheap way on this and just like doing it as like a flow over time is definitely maybe the intent of what DE wanted, and is also going to make it just way more bearable in the long run. Thankfully, if you overspend and just click this a bunch, you can back out before spending 140,000 ferrite, and just get all your resources back and go back into the menu, and you'll be right back where you started. So don't worry about misclicking anything here. You can always just back out, and nothing is set in stone until you click out of it at the very end with the confirmation page. That being said, I want to go through each and every one of these 6 things and talk about what is best to feed the Helminth, in terms of just what resources are actually worth it to give the Helminth, and which resources are just never going to be worth it and that you should just hold on to. For oxides, which is our first one here, this one's very, very easy. Alloy plate is 15,000. Ferrite is 20,000. Salvage is 20,000. Alloy plate, I think, is the best thing that you're going to want to always be feeding to the Helminth whenever you have the opportunity to, followed directly by ferrite and salvage. These are all very, very plentiful resources that you're going to have a ton of, and it's just, honestly, they're fair amounts, right? Like, it sounds like a lot to throw 20,000 salvage at something, but for a higher end system like this, I think it's actually totally fine. And for, you know, more experienced players like myself, I have 5.4 million salvage. 20,000 is really not going to hurt me too much to give this thing for getting something I want done. In addition to that, Oxium at 750, I feel is like maybe just barely a little high, but not too bad if you're a long-time player, or if you're completely done donating your Oxium to all of the things that you need to build already. Gallium at 25, I think, is very fair. Seems totally reasonable to me. And Tellurium is 10. So Tellurium is kind of based on if you farm the C-Lab tile set. If you do, then you probably have tons of Tellurium lying around. If you don't, then you probably don't. And that's really going to be the deciding point between whether or not this is worth it for you. But I think 10 Tellurium is actually a fair amount overall. Now, the shitty materials here are carbides and titanium. These are both railjack resources, and I'm going to say that a lot in this video. 20,000 titanium is a shit show. That is absolutely not and will never be worth it for this. 20,000 titanium for a system that, honestly, people aren't going to go back to is ridiculous. And when I say people aren't going to go back to it, I mean that railjack has zero long-term relevant farms. There's not Forma, there's not Endo, there's not huge amounts of credits, really. There's nothing that people are going to like go into railjack for that often that you would be able to accrue these levels of titanium that you would need to sustain this. And for that, I would say that you should never, ever give this thing titanium. And the same goes for carbides, and the same goes, quite honestly, for every single railjack resource that we're going to see today. DE has just way overestimated, like, honestly, the play rate of railjack, I think. It's kind of absurd to see 20,000 titanium right alongside 20,000 salvage, and if that doesn't put it into perspective on how ridiculous this is, I honestly do not know what will. Moving on, let's talk about Calx. Calx also quite an easy one. Calx kind of has a cheat code for it built in the form of Lucent Terra Globes. Lucent Terra Globes are a new resource from Deimos, and some of the new resources from Deimos give 60% instead of 30% when they are at full green, and Lucent is one of those. Loosened Terror Globes are quite plentiful. As you can see, I already have like 10,000 of them, and I've been feeding these things constantly. And getting 60% for 50 of these is just exceedingly worth it. If you can help it, I wouldn't actually spend anything but Terror Globes on this. It's an extremely good deal, definitely worthwhile. Honestly, worth going out and farming these if like you're low on them, or if you haven't been doing Deimos. Like if this is your first thing here, definitely what you're going to want to be feeding this for Calx. However, we have some important runner-ups. We have Groktrul, which is only 30, super fair. Groktrul quite plentiful on the plains. If you played during the plains era, it's very likely that you have a lot of this resource, as that's, you know, you were in the plains all the time, farming that stuff out. Probably have a ton sitting around. Great stuff there. And surprisingly, not Iridite. Iridite is fine at 50, but Iridite is considerably more rare than Groktrul, and I actually think for like kind of a number 3 on this list, that you should be donating Rubidoux. Rubidoux, quite common, 6,000. I don't think 6,000 is outlandish for Rubidoux. Totally fine. Now, of note on this list, Nullstones, Cubic Diodes, Gallows Rods, and Asterite. Once again, they're all Railjack materials, and it's absolutely they're all at absolutely nonsensical, absurd amounts that are needed. I've never had enough Nullstones, I think, in order to like feed this to the Helminth. Asterite, I have like 700 more than would be necessary to feed this thing once. Gallows Rods at 300. I think I was at 1,300 and fed this once, and that was honestly a mistake. I should have just waited for these other 4 great materials. And Cubic Diodes is maybe the closest to being okay, but once again, this is a Railjack material, and I know I'm just not going to be getting more of it, so it's not a good idea to spend it. Hexanon is kind of a weird one. If you're going to play a ton of the disruptions that give this material, I don't think that this is too outlandish to feed this thing 300, but because you have these 4 other options, I think that these are just going to be the ones you want to gravitate towards and use most often, and probably avoid Hexanon if you can, unless you're really trying to get something done. Now, Biotics has a ton of great options, an absolute ton. The number one with a bullet being Ganglion. This is another one of the new Deimos materials. This gives 60% instead of 30%. As you can see, I already have quite a good amount of this, and again, it takes 50, so this is definitely going to be the one that you're going to want to be feeding on Biotics at any given time that you really can. Super worthwhile, great stuff there. Followed up on this, we have Maprico, which is also only 50. This is a totally fair rate for this. Comes out of the plains very often. If you farmed for the Cetus Wisps, you would have tons and tons of Maprico because you just naturally run into it on the routes for the Cetus Wisps. So if you did any of that farming, you probably have a ton of Maprico, and that is great for that. And I kind of just want to mention here that like there are a number of other options here, like Pustulite, which is like fine, and this is another Deimos material, and that's great because it's going to give you 60%. And a number of these other ones, like, you know, Tepid Nodules are totally fine and all this stuff. That's all fine and good, and like Rux Claws are even totally okay, and Thresh Cones are fine, especially in light of the new mod that makes Oxalis scan plants for you. But if you needed to farm one of these very, very quickly that were not Ganglion or Maprico or Pustulite, I would really advise you to get Frostleaf. Of the plants that you have to scan out of the environment, Frostleaf is by far the easiest to get. There are many nodes in like the Corpus Ice tile sets that are going to spawn upwards of 15 of these in one area. So if you really need these, that's going to be very, very fast as compared to like lunar pitchers or anything else, which I don't think lunar pitchers are very worth it. Tons and tons of options on this list, which the 2 worst I will say I think are probably the sunlight choices here, and then also the lunar pitchers. But lots of good options in Biotics. No real problems there. Kind of nothing to complain about in general. Moving on, we have Synthetics. So Synthetics are really easy. There's a lot of good options here for players that have played for a long time. And there are 2 main options here that I think are hilariously easy to get. And those are Field Round Samples and Detonite Ampules. These are 125 each. So if you are any kind of a long-time player, you have tons of these, and they are very, very worth donating. In addition to that, there's kind of a tie, I would say, for third, and that is a tie between circuits and Orokin cells. If you are kind of done farming all the prime items, which I feel like a lot of people really go out of their way to get all the prime items done, and they have a lot of extra Orokin cells because of that, this also helps having a lot of extra Orokin cells because people use the Helen defense on Saturn to not only level frames, but also farm for Orokin cells. I think a lot of people have a good chunk of Orokin cells now, especially the people that farm that way. So I think 15 Orokin cells is actually not super outlandish as long as you're done farming the prime items, at least that you want. And circuits is also quite fair, but circuits have been a resource that people have needed quite desperately in the past, so I think they're not too far off of Orokin cells. And control modules at 75, I don't think is outrageous either. Once again, Arcrix capacitors, Kesslers, and comms are terrible here because they are the railjet materials. And then we have polymer bundle, which I think is just slightly expensive as compared to a lot of the other materials that we have a lot of, like circuits, which is at 7,000. So maybe not turbo worth it, but some people have a huge stockpile of these, probably worth it for those people. And then neural sensors at 25. I do feel like neural sensors should be at 15 with Orokin cells, but 25 is a fine number for these as they are not super needed for a lot of builds. Now, let's move on to pheromones. Pheromones have a hilarious amount of choices that are absolutely great for them. They have all of these pieces that come from the Juggernaut. So that would be the chitinous husk, the infected palpators, and the severed bile sac, and the pulsating tubercles, which I know is not the right way to say that, but I think it's hilarious. So they have all four of those options, and in general, I'm going to say that those are the best if you've been playing Deimos. There are a lot of Juggernauts on Deimos that are always going to award one of these or the blueprint for putting all these together, and I think 3 of these for any of this is totally fine. That is immediately runnered up by Nanospores, which is 20,000, which is absolutely completely worth it. Totally fine here. And then we have Neurodes. Neurodes at 15, just like Orokin cells, which I think is totally valid. There have been a much increasing number of ways to farm Neurodes over the last couple years as it stands, and these are quite plentiful, I find. Particularly if you are one of the people that farms Kuva, you probably have just a shit ton of these, and you might not even know it. So this one's going to be really easy for you as well. Once again on this list, Brachoids, Pustrals, Trachons, absolutely outrageous costs that don't make no sense. They're all railjack materials, just absolutely ridiculous asks on the amount of materials you need from railjack for doing any of this. Don't put railjack materials into this. Also, I would really like to note that the severed bile sac is not in the bile category for some reason, which is the one we're going to go over next. This is by far the shittiest category, and I think it's pretty much universally agreed that something's gotta happen with this category. This category needs more stuff in it. Basically, the only resource not pictured here that is in this is Argon. So there are 9 available resources. Of those, Argon is the best one to feed to the Helminth, as you only need 3 Argon in order to get 30%. That also is going to feed into a way to farm this that I'm going to talk about, but we'll get to that in a minute. The runner-up is Thermal Sludge, which is from Fortuna, and at 50, this is not horrible, but that's depending on how much Fortuna you did, of course. 50 is not too bad for this, especially because, you know, it's going to be hard to get that much bile. Following up on that, we have Morphix. Morphix, you know, at 40, Morphix are probably the most common of what would be considered a rare resource, and I think this is pretty much fine as it stands. So it could stand to be 35 in this category just because there's so many other garbage choices here. Moving on, we get to talk about the rest of the things here. So we have Isos, Fresnels, and Copernics. These are railjack materials, and they are absolutely not worth it under any circumstances. Holy shit. Absolutely dreadful. In addition to that, we have somatic fibers, which only come from demolishers on Lua. So if that's not where you farm your prime parts, you are not gonna have very many of these, if even enough to feed the Helminth one time. Lucky for me, that's where I farm my prime parts, so I had some of this to feed the Helminth. And then we have diluted thermia, which requires 5 diluted thermia. The only place this comes from is Orb Valis during an event, which is outrageous. I think, personally, this should be at most, absolute maximum, 1 diluted thermia, because that would actually encourage people to go back to Fortuna and do that event, which, in my opinion and experience, no one gives a shit about doing once they have the Super Vandal. Like, once you have, or no, that's the Opticore, actually, I believe. But that's the Opticore. Once you have the weapon from that event, no one gives a shit. So making this 1 would probably incentivize some people to actually go back and do it. But at 5, absolutely outrageous. Do not waste your time. And then we have Cryotic. Now, Cryotic is a material that you could have built up a lot of, right? Like, I think I was at like 80k or something before this system came out. And that's a lot of Cryotic, right? Like, that's multiple Cyber worth of Cryotic. It's a lot. But the reason I had so much Cryotic is because in the past, Excavation was the farming mode for Endo and often for Relics. Excavation, as it stands right now, is kind of a decrepit old farming mode that isn't really worth the time investment to play it in the vast majority of cases. And considering that 3,000 Cryotic is 30 excavators worth of Cryotic, that's an hour. Every time you click this button, that's an hour of farming this material in order to click this button once. And that is absolutely and completely outrageous. So in my estimation, what needs to happen for this Bile situation to be cleaned up is that you go to Pheromones and you take the severed Bile sack. Yeah, the Bile sack, that one. And you take this and you put it into the Bile category. And then you probably would also take Detonite ampules. You take this and you move it into the Bile category. And then we've kind of cleaned up the balance of where these materials are to have more things that are actually worthwhile in the Bile category. And also, that makes sense to be here, honestly. So yeah, that's the big issue with Bile right now. So we are also going to go over the way to farm Bile. Basically, the way to farm Bile is to get to the 8th Metamorphosis on Helminth. The 8th Metamorphosis gives you Sentient Appetite, which is this last column here, or option here, which allows you to feed sentient cores in order to make your Helminth hungry for a thing that it does not like. So if you have Argon, for example, or in this case, we're going to use Morphix, and you feed it a bunch. Oh, this is already full. Cancel that out. We're going to go, we'll just use, let's see here. We'll use Groctrul as an example. If you're going to, you would just do this with Argon. Basically, the way Sentient Appetite works is if you feed it too much and you get a red arrow, you can go to Sentient Appetite and then feed it 10 Exceptionals or 75 intact Sentient Cores or 5 Flawlesses or 5 Cetus Wisps, which is hilarious, or 2 Anomaly Shards, which is absolutely outrageous, in order to boost up one of the things that it doesn't like by 50%. Obviously, if you have it like everything except Argon, then Argon is the only thing this can possibly affect, even though it is usually random, which means you can spend Sentient Cores as a bolster for your Argon farming to always get 15%. Now, why do I say 15%? That's because in order to get it to like a material, you feed once, right? And 50% is actually only 50% of a red arrow. So now this is not actually going to give me 15% now. It's going to give me 7. Or, sorry, 14%. Wait, no, 9%. Brain's on fire. It's going to give me 9% because I gave it 10 exceptional sentient cores. But if we give it another 10, then we're finally getting ourselves that 15%. That's right. 20 exceptional sentient cores just to get this back to neutral. And no, you cannot keep feeding it to get things up into green, because apparently that would be too good. Sentient Appetite is really only worth it in the case where you are farming a bunch of Argon, and then utilizing this to make it kind of like Argon, because Argon disappears anyway, so you have no reason not to spend it all when you have it. That's the only time this can be considered useful, and that's really only if you've done like quite a large amount of sentient farming, because the values on these, as you saw, even for the cores, are kind of outrageous. But yeah, if you don't want to bankrupt yourself, the main rule that you just need to remember is that if you see a green arrow, you can click it. If there's not a green arrow, don't bother. That's really what the basics to this come down to. The green arrows will come back over time. Just wait for it. But yeah, do I like this system overall? I guess is a general question that a lot of people are going to wonder. I do like this system. I think it has obviously some issues, a lot with like the railjack materials being absolutely not worth it and stuff like diluted thermia and small things like that being a problem. But overall, I very much enjoy the system. I think it adds a lot to kind of the customization and like, opens up a lot of builds that people can do. And I think it's a good incarnation for a first incarnation, but I think some of the resources need to be checked up on. And then it would just be a much, much more enjoyable system overall. But yeah, that is going to do it for this video. I'm going to feed the Helminth and just get him his daily and probably level up to rank 9. Hope you guys have enjoyed this, and I will see you tomorrow.